yourself, you can go ahead and do that. Lisa is on her way, and she's just going to launch herself on stage when the time comes. And she will join us, and then we will open up the conversation. I am Mairi. I run Lighthouse Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. You can sit down now, just like you. And it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting today, facilitating today. These two, when the other one arrives, will kind of just be, they don't need any help. I'm just going to launch them in the direction of a topic and let them take. But I'm just going to do a brief introduction for Yassmin, who is a writer and broadcaster. She is the author of Talking About a Revolution, which we have over there, as well as some amazing children's books. And her work is largely focused on the civic movement, the justice movement in Sudan. And so, welcome, Yassmin.
Thank you all. I'm genuinely impressed that you're all here. My toes are still frozen. And I do have a hot water bottle underneath the scarf. So if I'm sort of clutching my belly, that's what's going on.
There is another hot water bottle if anyone gets desperate at any point. And the snug downstairs also has tea and coffee. So if afterwards you want to go and top yourself up, to have that on the horizon. I am going to start it off by asking, what does the word solidarity, what does solidarity mean to you?
Thanks for the question, and thank you all for your engagement in, I guess, the question of solidarity and the topic of solidarity. And I think I'll also speak sort of in Lisa's absence, although they're hopefully going to be walking very shortly, because Lisa's focus, as many of you may know, is on Palestine, and mine actually historically has been on Palestine, but more recently has been on Sudan, because that is where I was born, and that is a movement that I've kind of been connected to in lots of ways. And it's interesting to me, I think, sometimes when there are movements around particular issues that are very urgent, that feel very urgent, that are very urgent, and that sometimes feel like they require all of us. And then there can be a sense that these movements are in competition, or these movements are taking space from each other, or somehow that, focus on one means that it's kind of mutually exclusive to focus on another. And to me, that is antithetical to movement building. That is antithetical to justice, because ultimately, hopefully, the thing we understand is all of these systems of oppression are connected, and they all work kind of with each other to repress and oppress and so on. And so for me, solidarity is like a genuine belief and understanding that our, the truism that we're not free until we're all free is something that we live and breathe, is something that we understand and we have empathy for. And so if somebody feels particularly connected to one issue, that is fantastic, and we can kind of be connected through whatever issue we most care about, and also hopefully develop our understanding of the issue such that we understand that the ways that we are moving towards justice in one space will hopefully help and bolster the movement towards justice in others. Some of the things that I find fascinating about, to be honest, one of the things that is really sort of superficially, but also symbolically fascinating about Sudan and Palestine is that our flags are very similar, and people constantly mix them up, right? Like there was this, I think it was like last year actually, somebody ran onto a football pitch holding the Sudanese flag, and everyone was like, look, it's a Palestinian, and I was like, yes and no, like yes and also. And I think it's really interesting. And I think there's sometimes, something that people ask me a lot is like, how do you feel that Sudan isn't in the mainstream media a lot? How do you feel that people don't understand what's going on? And for context, for those who might not know, at the moment, the way that I would characterize the war in Sudan is that it's a counter-revolutionary war, right? It is a war that the sort of military-industrial complex within the country rose up against the civilian movement, this very successful revolution in 2018-2019, and this is about repressing that civilian movement, that movement towards justice. It is now, unfortunately, evolved into what some describe as a civil war, i.e., the various kind of, you'll often hear two different terms, the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is the traditional military, and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, which is another another militia that used to be under the auspices of the armed forces, but now kind of operate as two different militaries within the same country. And you'll often hear it, and I have in the past described this as like two generals fighting against each other. Ultimately, now it's turned into two kind of like military ecosystems, like military economic ecosystems, like fighting for supremacy against each other within the one country, bolstered by different kind of foreign interests, whether it's the UAE, Egypt, Saudi, etc. And then now you've kind of got lots of other countries kind of drawn in. And I'm getting in the weeds, so stop me if you're kind of like, we're losing track. But the reason, the ways in which the conflict has evolved, the ways in which also the international sort of... I remember my original point. Sorry. Yes, it is true that even though the war in Sudan at the moment is, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, the latest numbers are like 14 million people, a third of the country have been displaced. The number of people that have lost their lives, there are estimates that it's like over 150,000 in the last 18 months or so, that 90% of the system across the country have been destroyed, and so there are no accurate records. It is true that there is a frustration that this is not something that we hear more about, right, in the world. However, I don't necessarily think that attention is the thing that we should be always using as, like, attention is important. However, not all attention is the same, and not all attention gets us to the end that we need to be at, right? Because one could argue, and I have argued that, unfortunately, all the attention in the world hasn't necessarily moved the dial for Palestine, and that's a tragedy. That is a tragedy, right? And so thinking about, well, what does it mean for us to be in solidarity so that, yes, attention is important. Oh, Lisa, come on! Yes. Can we get Lisa a round of applause? Do you want to jump in? I'm just talking about solidarity. No. I'm honestly just waxing lyrical, and all these people are... Yes, here for the vibes. Well, what does solidarity mean to you, Lise?
Protection, in a way. Is this on?
Thank you.
I thought about it in chess metaphor. Does anybody play chess? One person, my person. Okay, cool. So I was working with a couple of artists, one in Egypt and one from Iran, and we developed this project where we would, because of censorship and because of the kind of thing we were involved in, we'd only speak in chess metaphor about everything. And so we talk about solidarity, we talk about protecting your pieces, right? The only one who really know what I mean. But we talk about protecting your pieces. And so through that, we kind of accidentally found this kind of sub-language for solidarity. So I started thinking about it in terms of protection. But then there's another thing that I think I want to bring up as well, which is the Palestinian context. There's certainly a school of thought whereby people don't use the word they use the word lahm. Lahm is like, it comes from like lahme, it comes from like meat. So lahm is like to be one. So it doesn't mean solidarity. It's not fully translatable, but they use it instead of using the word solidarity, right? Because it doesn't mean you are there and I am, I'm with you from over here. It means we have now formed one flesh, right? And I quite like that because it means what hurts you hurts me, right? There's a lot to pick apart with that as well, and like how much that feels like it does relate to different struggles. But I certainly think it's something to bring into the room and think about in terms of the different languages. And I think when we think about solidarity, what we're often think about the word allyship, think about solidarity, and we have all these nuanced conversations about what's the right way to talk about it. We're actually talking about proximity, right? What is our proximity to one another? What is my proximity to your pain? And what is my proximity to your fight? And so I think it becomes this what is the measurements in which we are in our togetherness with one another. So I think solidarity almost becomes mathematical in that sense.
Just hitting it out the park. Just walking on stage, serving it like it is. Lisa is a poet and an activist and part of Pal Action. And so today we've got two speakers with big hearts who are connected to very many movements. And again, that idea of interconnectedness. But we're going to center our conversation around Sudan and Palestine. Feel free when there are questions at the end to introduce another cause or struggle or passion that you are fighting for as part of your question. We're starting from that place that we are interconnected. These two know each other, and it was a complete accident that we put them on a stage together. Clearly the vibes, very tuned.
Well, if I may actually. Maybe, and I don't know if I don't know how it is to hear this, but like your evolution, I think, because when we first met, you may have been, but I was less aware of your direct action and the ways that you were engaging with movement. But we had many conversations about it, and it's been, I think it has brought me, I have felt, may I say, that like a deeper understanding with respect to movements, because like the conversations we've had about kind of activism and revolution and so on, we don't necessarily have the same ways of engaging in our activism, right? But what I really appreciate about you and about the conversations we've had is your very kind of clear-sighted sense that not everyone has to engage in, right? And everyone's positionality is different. I'm here on a visa. I'm sort of precarious in different ways. And we've had very open conversations about that. And also a sense, from you, you've said like, we have to be honest about our different positionalities and pushing things as far as possible, but also there being, I don't know if grace is the right word, but understanding and how these different things interlink. And I'd love to hear you speak more about that, actually.
Yeah, so just to mention something like evolution as well, I think we first properly came into contact in this sense in the 2019 Lebanese revolution, because I was on the ground, and you used your platform to amplify what we was doing on the ground and what was happening on the ground. This is the first kind of time that we came into Laham. Right, and kind of found that way to move together. And in terms of what you're saying about formation, it's that formation. I once said this to someone, and they said, "Yeah, like on a football pitch." And if that's your language, yeah, but I'm on about battlefield. You know what I'm saying? So like, if there's any cops in the room, I'm not saying pick up arms, right? But now that's out the way, because they are up my ass, you know what I'm saying? So if we're on the battlefield, somebody recorded that, right? So I can use it in court. If we're on the battlefield, ain't no business of mine. Like, if your target is over here and you're stationed over here, I ain't reaching what your target is over there. I have to focus on my position on the battlefield, because that's the position that I've taken on, right? And that is the position that I have to fight from. And that's really important for us to think in all manner of ways. What is our formation? Like in Palestine Action, for example, yeah, not everyone can be on the front line, but like good, because who's going to be outside the stations when people are released? Who's going to be sending money to those imprisoned? Who's going to be looking after the families, the fallout of situations? Who's going to be ensuring that the doors are fixed and what have you when the counter-terrorism cops come in and smash up your house? Like that, we need all those people. Who's going to be doing in court, taking the legal notes, right? Who's going to be, doing all of the logistics of the actions? Not everyone can be doing an action. It's not just this kind of like, throw yourself on the front line thing. There is a formation, right? Who's going to be the spokespeople? They probably can't be out there doing coverts because their face is very known. So it's like knowing what your role is and sticking to it, and that's within Palestine Action only. Then you look at the wider movement and like who can occupy what space and what's safe. I'm not of the belief, some movements are, but this isn't ours, that it's useful to get arrested. That's not what we're doing. We can talk about that after. There's a logic behind it, and it isn't that. That's more XR's kind of modus operandi, and that's their thing. That's their thing. But that's not necessarily useful. Like right now, we've just had 10 people taking this. Right now, they are in court and probably going to all be remanded and kept in prison without trial, right? That's 10 people off the battlefield. It's 8, actually. It's 8 people off the battlefield. What use is that if all of us now just decided to smash up this beautiful venue? We're not going to do that at all. But you know what I'm saying? Like, for absolutely no reason but to make a point and get arrested. There's no purpose to it. And so it's kind of activating also what you're good at and what you bring to the table. You know, I learned that from a young age, being asked, what are you bringing to the table? What are you bringing to the table? Pack of cards, fine, cool. Whatever you bring to the table, your food, a dish, whatever, like, just bring something to the table. If you don't have anything in your pockets, then bring good conversation. You know, like, that's what I'd be told.
And care. And I think this is important as well, because sometimes I think I know for myself, that's something I have to remind myself, because, you know, sometimes there is this sense of a hierarchy of like, what is more valuable in a movement, or what is whatever. Like, we feel like we should be doing X because, you know, that's the thing that might be celebrated, or that's the thing that might be whatever. But actually, none of these things can exist without each other. And for me, when you say tarahum, when you say, you know, we're all part of one kind of body, there are all different. There's no point in a toe trying to be like a vein, right? Like, it's fully not its job, right? And so figuring out and being very secure in what role we can, and actually that role might change and evolve over time. Like, what I could do when I lived in Australia, what I could do when I was in Sudan with an Australian passport, for example, is very different. And so, like, also thinking about being quite honest with ourselves about what is possible, what we can bring, what we find comfort in, what we find discomforting but still important and still has a purpose. And I do think, like, having those honest conversations with ourselves and then within movement allows us to be much more effective.
Can I ask if each of you can tell us how you got to where you are and how you've chosen the kind of solidarity work, the kind of movement building work that you are in now? Like, what is that journey over time, milestones of it, where you've ended up where you are today, and whether or not you envision in the future or with different forks in the road that you might see that evolving? So for me, I grew up in an Arab household. My father was from Haifa in Palestine, so I always grew up in a household that obviously centered Palestinian liberation. And then as I grew up, I engaged more in different struggles for indigenous people all over. About 6-7 years ago, I moved to Beirut, which is where my dad had, where we still had family and what have you. And the Lebanese Revolution broke out, right? Now, Lebanese Revolution is obviously, you know, very kind of nationalist. It concerns those who, let's go back to the measurements. You're measuring your proximity to how you position yourself on the battlefield of a revolution, like a countrywide revolution in that sense. And so I started to engage in a mutual aid capacity. So I'd fly back with my British passport, collect resources and funds to go back and be able to get gas masks for the frontliners so that when the tear gas comes, you can keep fighting, right? So things like that, right? Getting the solar powering to power up Martyrs Square. Martyrs Square was like the Tahrir Square. It's like the center point of the revolution. So, my role would be doing things like that, like sorting out solar powering because they cut off electricity, right? So we'll solar power you bitches, right? So then we have this kind of role that you find yourself in where you are assisting the revolutionaries in a way from your place. So time goes on. I'm still living in Beirut, and then 2021 happens, May 2021, and it's a siege in Palestine, in Sheikh Jarrah, which I'm sure you don't know about. And I'm there, like Lebanon is like next door to Palestine. It's one land. Like we feel it in the ground. We feel it in the air when we go out. Like we can sense it. You know what I mean? And I see this at this point. Sorry, let me just say, I'd kind of co-founded different transnational movements, one of them being called Ila Beirut, and that was a international network of trauma-informed psychologists who supported the mental health services in Lebanon after the Beirut blast. So there's obviously some backlog of need for access to mental health services. So he's bringing in all of these international trauma-informed therapists. So just keep in mind what I'm witnessing in these instances. So then, following that, like the same year, I co-founded an anti-racism collective called Nahnu Hon. So this was for women specifically, or largely single mothers, victims of the kafala system, which is modern-day slave trade, right? So people who've been through human trafficking, who have been in, domestic workers, to dress it up very politely, and this is the language that's used. And then in the fallout of the crises, all of these women were just being dumped on the street because their madame wants to leave the country and flee. You don't know what to do with your domestic worker, so you dump her outside of her embassy, right? So this was happening en masse. So I became really engaged in that fight, right? And we'd set up school, nursery, which would not only give these women childcare so that they could get jobs, but also would create jobs as well. So I was doing all of that. So what I'm witnessing is just a fallout of these hierarchies of power constantly. And I'm kind of dealing with the, how the doctors say it, there's the preventative and then there's the symptom. Yeah. Treating the symptoms, right? You're treating the symptom, yeah? And so then I see online this movement pop up with the red boiler suits back in England. And they are going for the Israeli arms companies at the source. They're not trying to do petitions and march slowly through the streets politely. No, they are destroying the resources of the IOF. They're making it so that there are less arms available. And so I'm like, this is actually what my passport tells me that my role is in this, actually. So I hand over all of these movements, obviously the Nahnu Hon, hand it over to the women who are most concerned. You set up the infrastructure, you go for it now, right? Like, and just came back to England and fought from within the belly of the beast in the way that I could, again, taking that mathematical measurement of sacrifice as well, and what it is that I could do best. I'm sorry if I took a very long time saying that and took up too much space.
Not at all.
But it just felt like I had to tell you the timeline.
Yeah. Perfect. MashaAllah. So I was born in Sudan and born to parents who were both engaged but in very different ways. My mom, the story my mom often tells is of, because both my parents left Sudan because of the arrival of Omar al-Bashir, who was the dictator of the time, and he sort of arrived took power in a coup in 1989. But the stories that my mother would tell was, the military was kind of advancing onto the university, and she sort of stood there and closed the gates in front of the army guy's face or whatever. So she was the one picking fights in the street. My dad sort of came, and my mother was much more working class, I would say, and for her and her family, education was kind of social mobility. Whereas for my father, he came from a much more middle class family that engaged in politics in a sort of, in the more middle class way, even in Sudan, right? They sort of were sitting around having discussions and so on. And so when my mother was kind of being dragged off to the white fence in the middle of the city to get her arm chopped off because she was, misbehaving, he was like, we're leaving the country. And so we get to Australia. We're the second Sudanese family in Brisbane. The next family doesn't come till 10 years later. So we're sort of the only Africans in the village, as it were. And they brought me up with a deep sense of commitment to justice and to community, but a depoliticized one, right? Because for my father, and my father was kind of the one who dictated the rules of the house, as it were, Australia was a place where the politics worked, there was democracy and there was systems, and like that was the path. If you wanted to get things done, that was the path to do it. And so I grew up very kind of engaged in politics, but not in a way that was outside the system. It was very much kind of through the system. So like I started, a community organization when I was 16 called Youth Without Borders, and it was all about kind of doing community programs and whatever, but it was not necessarily about challenging the basis on which the system was built. It was kind of accepting that the system here worked, and that was if only Sudan could have a system like Australia kind of thing. So the thing, and that's actually kind of what I chart through the essays in the book is my kind of political evolution, because ultimately what happened is that I sort of, became the model of the good Muslim migrant in the Australian context, right? I was sort of raised up and seen as like, this is how you behave if you're a good Muslim immigrant, blah, blah, blah. Until they started to realize that actually my politics were not accepting of the status quo. I just kind of gave it a presentable face. And a couple of public things happened, and at this point I had sort of become a public figure. And I then became what you might call like I was made an example out of, right, in the kind of public context. And in 2017 sort of turned from what you might call like the sort of the good Muslim migrant into, the controversial Muslim activist, and we had to kind of destroy her and tear her down or whatever. I did not have the political framework to understand what was going on at the time, right? I couldn't understand because that had not been the political understanding that I grew up with. Even though I had been around radical spaces, I had not understood, right? We often talk about Palestine being the entry point for a lot of people. My first protests were Palestine, when I was 13, 14, 15, but I still hadn't understood. So come to me being 25, 26, seeing the people that I thought were my allies, the people that I thought had my back, sort of turn around and be like, no, you've gone too far. Family in Sudan sort of didn't want trouble, and I was like, let me start again. And so began my like true political, I would say, evolution, and we all go through it in some way, shape, or form, right? Where you're awakening, as it were. And then I sort of decided, my strategy changed. I was no longer interested. I had thought the visibility would lend me some sort of power. Right? I thought that visibility on television and so on would give me a power that would allow me to influence things for real. But I found that wasn't true. Maybe for other people, but certainly for me, it wouldn't. And so I started to think, okay, what ways can I, in the context that I'm in today, in the UK, as somebody on a visa, as somebody who doesn't have like the networks necessarily, but is like learning and understanding, like what ways can I contribute? And I think it ended up going around two different paths. One was literally consciousness raising, like going back to the old school, telling stories and educating and using my experiences to be like, hey, because I think there are a lot of people who grew up like me, who care, but who are a bit scared of things, of like really disrupting the system because it is a bit frightening, and maybe that isn't how you grew up or whatever. And things have changed since 2017, but I still think that's a process and a journey for people. And the other was my then engagement with Sudan, because so I had lived in Sudan in 2012, like post the sort of Egyptian, Tunisian, like Arab Spring, and Sudan was trying to get rid of the dictator for the first time, and I was there kind of writing about it, etc. Things started to get like a little bit hairy, so my family was like, go back to Australia. And then come 2018-19, where the revolution that successfully toppled Omar al-Bashir was happening, and I realized that I might not, my family was very, like, unfortunately, well, understandably, I should say, they were like, we do not have the resources to protect you. We do not want you to bring trouble to our doors, because ultimately that's what I would be bringing. And they were like, you have a different passport, you can leave, but we do not. And so they did not want me to come into the country. And so then I was like, well, the ways in which I can contribute is by telling the story, is by writing about it, is by interviewing, is by sending money, is by supporting, and using the kind of social platform that I had that I developed over the years in order to uplift, right, and to amplify and to whatever. And that's one of the things that I still continue to try to do, is to literally direct resources in whatever way possible to the people on the ground. I see myself purely as a conduit, right, because I think when I was a kid, I thought I would be able to pick up arms, but I think I'm too much of a wuss, to be perfectly honest. I think, I would I don't actually know that is where even though I would like to think that's who I am, I actually don't know that it is who I am. But what I can do is tell the stories of the people who are, right, is lend my voice and my platform and my storytelling skills to the people who are. So that has evolved since. So I reflected very recently. I was like, oh gosh, how is it that my main practice is actually writing? I never thought that that's what my main practice would be. I always thought that it would be kind of much more logistical, and yes, that stuff does come into it. But I think the thing that I spend the most time doing is thinking about how to tell the story, and also trying to figure out the kind of the ways in which we can be successful. How do we survive victory? How do we, once the revolution has happened, how do we build forward? I have built numerous different community organizations over the years. How do we use how do we actually build movements successfully and continue it beyond just the battlefield? Because that is actually a different problem. And that's one that I think Sudan hasn't been able to fix. How do you go from, an armed revolution where you get rid of the despot to a successfully, demilitarized society? That's the problem Sudan has. The only way that you get to the table is if you're holding a gun. That is not a way that a peaceful society can continue, certainly in our experience. So what does it look like to move beyond that? That's what I spend my time thinking about. That's what I spend my time trying to engage people on. It is very different to what I imagined, but it's where I've landed for the time being. Come to me in 10 years and we'll see where I'm at, inshallah.
Thank you both for those incredibly generous answers and giving us sort of a context of how you've ended up here for now. And also, you're moving at 12 million miles an hour, and there's so many answers to so many of my questions embedded in both of your answers. So I'm going to pull at some threads, and then you can do you and pick up whichever one you want. I want to start, one thread I want to pull on is this idea of empathy building, of this idea of knowledge. So we see this in two different ways. One, there's this sense of if white kids don't read about black kids, then they won't care about black kids. And then there's representation. So you get your books going into the ether is here's a Sudanese kid doing these. They are great books. Even if you are a grown-up, I would say they're very galvanizing. Such a cool
And Christmas
kid.
is coming.
Christmas is coming. And Eid.
But that idea of putting something in the water that allows another generation to come up, reading about, experiencing, seeing kids, both themselves and other kids in these ways. But that there's also an element that you see with conversations, for instance, around Palestine, of people being it's too complicated, I don't know enough about it, so until I know everything, until I have my PhD in, for geopolitics in the Middle East, I couldn't possibly weigh in or show up. And so I need to educate myself. And it feels in some ways that both of those are facets of the same disempowering position of being I'm not equipped for this, or I don't know enough. Or these are other people. These are other people's experiences. And so I'm curious about that idea of how do we engage with that space, that either the gap in empathy or that fear of not knowing enough, and empowering people to feel that sense that we are all connected. These are all of our struggles. My freedom is your freedom is mine. Whether it's here or 10,000 miles away, we nourish ourselves in our spaces when we engage. So how, if I were to pull that thread, and you can pick it up on any one of those points, go for it.
So I want to make 2 to 3 points. The first one being, so going to start mixing metaphors now because I'm going to talk about a resource called Mapping the Battlefield. I don't want you to necessarily think about the way that I used it previously. Does anybody know this resource? Has anybody seen this resource, this visual? No? It's available. You can find it quite easily. It's come from civil rights organising. So look up Mapping the Battlefield or the Spectrum of Allyship, and one of them is more detailed than the other. And what it is it shows this literally a spectrum. So it's a half circle, and it's got these divides in it, and it shows different places that people are from an active opposition to an active ally, but more than ally. So somebody who is like deeply in the movement, shoulder to shoulder with you, or maybe you're not even at that point. Maybe you're kind of at a different point. So it's got active opposition, passive opposition, and then it kind of looks at those who are kind of neutral, but perhaps can be won over slightly. Those who are in the know and have put some time into educating themselves but haven't activated that and aren't taking any actual action. And then it comes on to those who are taking action. Look at it. I was thinking this morning, I wondered if I could show you in any way, but I can't. But you can find it. Now, a friend of mine, Jess Marley, you know Jess, right? Jess is a great anti-racism educator as well. And her and I were doing these online kind of teach outs on Palestine at the end of last year. Now, what Jess does as an anti-racism activist, an educator, is she's very good at bringing people in. Yeah, she's very good at taking the time and having the patience to, right? Yeah, to she is anti-calling out. She calls it call in instead of call out, right? So this is Jess. This is not me. Yeah.
I love it because sometimes Lisa sends people to Jess. She's like, I can't deal with it. Like, Jess, you handle this person.
So my placement is Aries, Leo, Leo. For those who know, they know that I don't have that patience. But that's okay because it means that we did kind of a finding your place kind of seminar, and then a kind of activating your place. So what I'm good is at this half. So I'm good at training people, training up the next generation of frontliners. This is what I do well, and I know that this is what I do well. And so it's in terms of empathy, I think it's not one size fits all. Some of us are going to do a very different job at adjusting those gaps. And I think understanding what we're good at in that, being really honest about that, and using that well is how we just cover all bases, right? So this is the first point I wanted to make. The second point about the multiple struggles is, so part of my work in Palestine Action as well is working with other organisations and other movements such as Black Lives Matter UK, Sisters on Cut, Palestinian Youth Movement, Parents for Palestine, and looking at how ways in which we move together, right? Ways in which we create that talahum, right? And having those meetings and drawing people in. I think this is this has become. Let me put it this way: a year ago, or even 2 years ago, other organisations. This isn't about the ones I've just mentioned. This isn't me throwing shade on those, like at all. But a lot of other individuals or organisations were quite anxious about aligning themselves with Palestine Action because they saw us as very radical. They saw us as the ones who were most likely and still are most likely to be categorised as extremists. And now it's even in the there's a potential of us being prescribed, right? Which is insane, right? But now what we're seeing at this point of the genocide is organizations and individuals coming forward and saying, you're the only ones who are actually having any effect now. You're the only ones who we can see have actually made any productive action. And so how can we sit down and support you? And so this is something where we see that our souls are connected. Sisters Uncut, their fight started with, in terms of domestic violence cuts. And now they are generally against state violence. That's their fight. They're against state violence. Okay, so this is a connective tissue, right? Anti-racism is a huge connective tissue. Palestine Action is an anti-racist movement, right? It's removing the weaponry that's available for racist regimes to carry out colonial violence, right? So you start finding the meeting points. So it doesn't matter if everybody's on the front line. We're not going to BLM UK and saying, can you get all your cohorts to come on the front line? We're not saying that at all. It's what resources have you guys got? Cool, this is what we've got. So our resources are available to you. Yeah, your resources are available to us. Fantastic. Now we are protected by one another. So what you see happening is this week when we had 10 people, house raided, so like days, their families displaced, their furniture and homes smashed up by the counter-terrorism mob, and then taken from us. Then on Thursday night, this mass mobilization from different movements calling in their people, surrounding the cells where our people were kept, and chanting, "We are all Palestine Action," which makes it impossible to locate Palestine Action in that. We're all saying we are all Palestine Action. It's a lot harder for you to come for the individuals as protection. That protection can only come when we do that resource exchange, right? Because that's people bringing in their arresting support crews, right? And that's, I hope, answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, oh my God, I had so many things to say, but something that you just said there, I'm going to start in a slightly different place. And there's a quote that I referenced in this quotation that I can't find, but when I reflect on my experience in Australia and sort of being pulled out and made an example of, the thing that I often think about is that I had absorbed the Thatcherite and Reaganite position of like essentially like social justice in a neoliberal way, right? Social justice, it's through the individual rather than social justice through the collective. Like thinking that me as an individual was enough, and if I had if I had understood more deeply that the only way that we could be successful was to genuinely be collective, then, you know, I would have already done the work of developing, you know, I would have been part of a movement, and so I wouldn't have been able to be picked off in the way that I was, right? And so because I think ultimately that's what happened. I was picked off as and that was used as like a chilling factor, right? It was used as a way to say to all the other young Muslim and African kids especially, like, you know, this is what will if it can happen to Yassmin, it can happen to any of you, right? But if we had done a better job of like, oh, Yassmin is not actually just by herself, that she's part of all of us and we are one, then it wouldn't have been possible. I think I would like to hope that lesson has been learnt, but I do think it's something that we have to continue to practice. Like, I think of movement building and justice work as a practice. It's not something you learn once and then you just sort of store away. It's something that you continue to activate. And so, yeah, I think part of people's fear is because we have absorbed the individual or the neoliberal mentality of, you know, my success, or, you know, I'm the one. Even the way we tell stories about particular activists is about the individual as opposed to thinking about the movements they were part of, right? Like, we continuously tell the stories of individuals, but their success was only because, and in fact, the ones where things fell apart after their passing or after their assassination is an example of how perhaps the movement was maybe not as robust, or maybe not, like, I think there are different lessons we can kind of pull out of that. But I think it is challenging for us to think of ourselves as genuinely part of movements because we live in a world that celebrates the individual and elevates the individual to such a pedestal that we think that that's the kind of the natural order of things. But I do think there's something like really, and it's just something that I'm constantly thinking about, is how much is my ego playing a part in this? How much is my sort of sense of individual, quote unquote, success in this important to me? And how much am I trying to actually, am I putting the cause at, like, above myself, right? And I think that's really important for us to think about, even in the stories that we tell. The other thing that there's a quote by my man Walter Benjamin, and he talks about he says that fascistic governments maintain power and control by allowing the public to express themselves aesthetically, keeping them far from the work of material reform. And, the sort of quote continues, but I think there's something fascinating about us focusing on the aesthetics of movement and the aesthetics of, and the symbols, rather than being like, to your point, like how effective is the actual action? Are we just obsessed with the symbol, or are we obsessed with its efficacy? And kind of coming back to what's actually effective, I think, is challenging. But that's kind of what fascistic governments are very good at. They're like, we'll let you play over here, where it's not actually going to change anything, but the power is over here, and that's where the realm in which we're operating in. So, like, really thinking about what is aesthetic, what is, pandering to our ego, what is whatever, versus, like, what is actually having material impact, I think is something that we can something I'm continuously coming back to. Now, in the realm of symbols, though, I mean, I do think that stories can be more powerful. And this is partly, I was smiling as you were telling the story, because my first teen novel, You Must Be Layla, was about, the Sudanese kid who has a fight at her school. And one of the critiques of the book was that I was dealing with too many issues. And I was like, do you know, like, kids today? And so what I just did was add a revolution on top of the second book. And so in the second book, she literally goes to Sudan and gets involved in the revolution. I was like, haha. But there's, I felt really passionate about, she's a 14-year-old girl who's grown up in Australia, but when she goes to Sudan to see her grandmother, she does get involved in the revolution. And you might think that's a bit too intense for a 14-year-old, kind of like for kids to read in grade 7 or whatever. But actually, that's what they're interested in. And they want to see those stories. And she doesn't, she makes mistakes. It's not perfect. She's scared and it's frightening. But also she finds a way through it, and then she thinks about, okay, how do I take these lessons and apply it to my context in Australia? And how do I think about, oppression of First Nations people and so on? And so I do think that, like, when I think about, the stories that activated me, and that really did those activations, it was about ways in which I could then see myself, like, I could feel the fear, because I think, okay, I'm just going to sidestep slightly. I also think some of the fear is an excuse. Right, and I think we have to be honest sometimes about what, because I'll tell you what, people were very happy to take a position on Russia and Ukraine, and they knew nothing about that. People don't know most people don't know anything about that history, and, and are very willing to make loads of assumptions that are often very kind of inflected by a Western imperialist position, but everyone was happy to fly a blue and yellow flag, right? And so it's interesting to me about, like, when we're quite honest about what's going on, where you can kind of start to reveal people's, actual intentions. So often when I hear sort of, well, I don't understand enough or whatever, I'm like, but do you know your own values? Because sometimes it's a question of values. Do you know your own values? And are you willing to, like, why is it? Because if something's actually a value, it should be pretty easy to sort of speak to that value. But if you're actually, if what you value is self-preservation versus justice, even though you say justice is the thing you care about, then let's have a more honest conversation about that.
We've run slightly over 12 o'clock. We started about 15, 20 minutes late. So we're going to keep going. But if you need to leave, if you need to move about, if you need to get somewhere else very slowly through the snow, then we will not take it personally.
I genuinely wouldn't bother. I just came in from out there. No one's moving anywhere. You might as well be here. But yeah, you do.
Just stay for the day. I want to pick up on a few things in it. I do think you're so right around fear, and you're so right that we live in this culture that doesn't allow the space for people to learn to be wrong and to evolve a position and to be like, I know enough to live my values. And if somebody comes and educates me about a certain position or gives me, then I can evolve, and I'm allowed to have been wrong. And we can meet people where they are, and there's something in that resilience that we need to instill in people of, like, sometimes it is better to do something, to move somewhere. And if I may interrupt you, sorry, I think you're totally right. It's okay for us to be wrong. Like, and not to keep banging the drum, but part of the reason I wanted to put this collection together was because my politics changed over my 20s, and I wanted to be really honest about that. And I wanted to
to like lay it out and be like, look, this is what I thought when I was 22, and like, it's a bit embarrassing, but I'm going to be honest about that, because we're not born knowing, and we have to have, like, for me anyway, I have to have the capacity to meet people where they're at, because you know what, they are going to evolve, and it might be the case that you enter the movement through like ferrying mobile phones, and then you end up on the front line. It might be the case that you sort of end up just bringing keys at meetings, and then next, in 5 years' time, you're sort of like calling the rallying call. And I think that's what movement building is about. Movements have to be big. Like, well, in my view, a movement, you want to bring in people into movements. I mean, I don't know if you agree, Lisa. What do you reckon?
I think it's in the word movement. You're not supposed to be static. You're not supposed to know and reach a goal. And you reach the goal and you certainly put your feet up. We call it social movement for a reason, because we and the movement and the cause itself is always in motion. Yeah, I think people kind of, words become furniture almost, and you stop seeing them. But like, they've been called movements for a reason. And I think that to me kind of encapsulates the individual themselves has to say in movement.
I wanted to ask, picking up on something both of you brought up around success. So we become activated, we become involved, we join in with the struggle. What does success look like for solidarity movements and for movements? What is that? Yeah. So, what would success look like to you, either in immediate concern for the immediate, so Palestine Action Movement, some checking out, and then the ability to envision that, like, we're fighting for a day after the revolution and the world we build after. What does that look like? So, success. What does that look like?
So, if I may speak on Palestine Action again, and just its concrete outcomes and how it works with the resistance. The long history of resistance in Palestine itself. So the principles of the movement and the strategy of the movement oscillate around primary targets, which are the arms companies. So Israel's largest arms company, who provide 85% of their killer drone fleet, and also land fleet and munitions as well. A lot of their intelligence operations are done with technology that's built here. It operates here. 85. So the largest Israeli arms company is operating here, right? Actually, sorry, not in Scotland, but Thales is in Scotland. So Thales is a French company that are in Scotland that are also working. Of course, something really exciting to tell you guys. Thales are a French company who are working with Elbit Systems. Now, the main thing that those two have together is a factory in Leicester, in England, right? So they have UAV tactical systems. There's a factory in Leicester, right? So this factory is built on the development and the production of the Watchkeeper drone, right? The UK government have just dropped that contract, right? That's Elbit Systems' biggest contract that they have. And the UK Defence has just dropped that contract with them, which means that the Leicester side, that Thales and Elbit have this little home that they built together in England, it's gonna fold, right? So yes. Now, so as I was saying, so we have our primary targets of Thales and Elbit, and then we have the secondary targets, which is people who they rely on to do business with. So it might be their recruiters, it could be their insurance companies, it could be their logistics companies. You get the idea, right? And so you target the primary target so that you're making them an unreliable business. So they don't know from day to day if they can carry out their deliveries, if they can meet their commissions. And there's something called just-in-time logistics, which the arms trade works to. And what that is that parts are made separately and then they're assembled in the last stage to go out. So essentially, Sorry, I'm getting a very truncated version of this. This bit that I'm going into usually takes me about an hour to go through, but I'm going to give you a very, very truncated version. But I think when we talk about success, I just want to get the mechanisms of the movement really clear to people who might not know it. Just-in-time logistics means that if a site is targeted this week, and the drones and the machinery that creates the weapons is dismantled, then we know that there are less munitions available next week. We actually know that a lot of them have a 24-hour turnover, right? So we know that there is a concrete effect, that tomorrow there are less arms available to the IOF, right? So you're weakening the enemy. So you're making Elbit Systems or Thales, you're making them an unreliable business. They can't fulfill the demands. This is how they lose contracts, right? You're also entering sites. So if they're working with the Ministry of Defense, every time an activist enters a site, they have to report a breach of security. Now, there's only so many times the Ministry of Defense can work with a company having this much breach of security, right? Once again, you see the dropping of contracts. At this point, they're losing so much money that they can't sustain keeping open the amount of factories that they have open. Now, the secondary targets, you target them, right, to say you keep doing business with Elbit and we're going to keep doing business with you, right? And so then you start seeing these companies cut ties because it's just not worth it for them. Like, it's a business contract. They don't rely on Elbit. They're recruiters, but they have loads of other contracts as well. So they cut their ties with them because it's not worth them being targeted. You're creating that dilemma for them, right? So we've seen, I think, one of the biggest successes in the secondary targets is there's a company called K&N, Kuhn & Nagel. Now, they're one of 6 logistical companies in the world that have the license to transport arms. One of 6. That's who have the license. So they transported arms to the South African apartheid regime. How did they do that? Via Israel, right? So they were the logistics company for Elbit, so we targeted them. So they got in contact with us because they have to make a statement to us, otherwise we keep targeting them. So they got in touch with us and they have to show evidence. So they got in touch with us and said, like, look, we're not doing business with them anymore. Khalas, leave us alone, right? And so, like, then actually all they were doing was disguising their lorries. So they were still going in and out, but they just disguised their lorries so that they think that we're that stupid. Like, we have, like, are you kidding me? Like, we just run your license plates. You can see exactly which company is coming in and out of the site, right? Okay, now we'll escalate on you, right? And eventually now they have officially cut ties, right? And that's a $30 billion company who have been forced to cut ties. And that is 1/6 of the resources available to move the arms Israel's biggest large weapons company have now lost, right? That's a huge part of their pool. So for us, it's very much about concrete action. Nothing that we do is gimmick. We don't do an action for the pictures. We do it because we know exactly where the money is. We know exactly where resources are moving. We know when deliveries go out, etc., etc. And so we know when to blockade. Nobody's getting arrested for the sake of clogging up the police stations like some movements do. No, the reason people get arrested is because the thing is, stay there as long as you can. The longer you stay there, then the longer they stay closed, and the more of a dilemma you cause them, right? So it's very much about concrete actions in that way. And when we talk with people in Palestine, that's what they recognize. So we are guided by people in Palestine and their resistance, letting us know that this is still working, right?
Can we just give it up for Palestine Action? You know, Lisa, as we were talking, I felt so proud. Even though I've got nothing to do with it, I just really felt proud. Because I think, like...
And this is what... Sorry, just going back to what you were saying about governments and fascist governments saying, yeah, you guys go play over there, that's fine, as long as you're not having any concrete changes. And that's why the state is coming to war with us. that's why they're coming into our homes and smashing up our homes. Like, that's why they're warring with us, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, when they start to call you extremists, when they start to like really make life difficult for you, that's when you know you're being effective, right? And I think that's something really to pay attention to. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure really what I can add to that, because I think that is a fantastic, and to be honest, it's something that as you were talking, I was like, oh gosh, what is a version like that for Sudan? Because Sudan is a context where, you know, the RSF would not be able, if it wasn't for, you know, arms coming in through the UAE, which are likely British arms.
I wanted to ask you about this, because I've often wondered about this.
So let me say, you know, gold. Anyway, we'll come back. Yes.
No. So I've been educated myself through. There's a podcast called The Markham Effect. You guys listen to that? Yeah. It's really good. It's kind of very good political education. And for me, it was the best political historical education on Sudan. So I listened to that about a year ago, and ever since then, I've been racking my brains as to how a Palestine Action kind of movement would work within the framework of Sudan, and I haven't figured it out. Obviously, my head's been there, but it's been in the back of my head, and I've wanted to chat to you about it. So,
well, maybe you heard it here first, though. Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, because I think one of the challenges the Sudanese movements have had, and I say movements with an S, is because, like, there was the initial success was the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, right? But it was very, very clear that, like, so the military replaced him with, like, you know, just another puppet, and the people remained on the streets, and they were like, we refuse. And then they replaced him again with another puppet, and eventually the people stayed on the streets for long enough that a transitional council, and there was a civilian-led government for like a good 2 years, and then at that point, at the end of that, you know, you saw the sort of the military come together to overthrow the civilian movement, and there was a while where the people were refusing, but now we've kind of reached a point where, like, the life is inhospitable, and unfortunately we are at the point where it is not weapons, but it is famine. It is like old school diseases that we got rid of hundreds of, like, decades and centuries ago. People should not be dying from the flu and cholera and, you know, like TB and things like this, but that is kind of what is happening at the moment, and literally famine, because Sudan is able to grow enough food to feed the people, but they are raising the ground, you know. And also, may I say, I know I keep banging on about the UAE, but the UAE is just like paying its way through this world right now, and Western governments, America, the UK, etc., see it as a nice ally in the region, so they're essentially like collateral damage. Like, do what you want in that desert, you know, as long as we've kind of got you on our side and there's enough capital that they can move things along. So we shall have a conversation about that, inshallah. All right. I think we're almost at time, probably, at this point.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, we're almost there.
Do one more. I'm having a nice time.
As long as everyone's feeling okay. If you need to stand and stretch, that's also...
Give me a wave if you had a question, so I know... Okay, we've got a couple. Brilliant. I'm going to ask a last little question just around that space where these spaces meet a book fair, meet a book space, and sort of digging where you are. And Lisa, we were talking yesterday in the car on the way home, like... The first time I saw you was when you were waving around bus cards in Leicester in May last year, being like, take a bus card, you're going to need this phone number.
I was right.
Yeah, and you were right. I was very glad for my bus card when I got arrested. But I recognize you as, it was like, here is this person who is marshalling people, who is using that voice that I have heard perform poetry. Here is this poet in this space, this meeting of these two worlds. And I think that appears over and over in your book, this thing of being in these spaces that you are operating in. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about where these worlds overlap, and for an audience that is coming to a book fair, like where and how do we activate those mixed spaces or encourage our literary spaces to be a part of that world?
Yeah, so you're talking about the siege that we laid on the UAV tactical systems in Leicester. So the month-long action that just surrounded the factory. So I'm going to tell you a story that I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, but it's only going to speak to my cynicism around whether what you're asking is possible, because I don't like to dress up the fact that we're at a book fair and books are really great and that's enough, because I sincerely don't believe that it is, and I would ask your forgiveness for a controversial opinion, but I cannot, in the kindest way possible. After the Beirut blast, I was due to finish writing this book and hand this book in, and like the city was still collapsing. It was, the people were filling the gap where a government should go, and it was completely anarchic in its most political, like in a political organising sense, anarchic. And I certainly didn't feel like writing literature was a particularly productive thing at the time. It seemed really, really luxurious. And what I was spending most days doing was delivering resources on my moped, as much as would fit on it. And the most requested resource was rice. Most requested resource in crises is rice. Rice is very versatile. Yes, it's versatile in food and sustains you, but it's also versatile if there's loads of people sleeping in one small room, because you can kind of create seating or pillows from it. It can also kind of work, it can work as insulation. Rice is incredibly versatile in crisis. So this was the most asked for thing. Now, there's one family that I got to know really well. They were a Syrian refugee family. I say refugee because it's something that's done to a people, it's not an identity. So the Syrian refugee people whose baby was very, very sick. So I was working with them to kind of put pressure on the medical care to be able to offer them what was necessary. And I'd go around on Sundays. And I remember there was one Sunday where the father, Khalid, he said to me, like, what do you do, by the way? And I said sheepishly, I'm a poet. So he said what everybody says when you say that. Can you give us a poem? Now, I don't write in Arabic, one, and we only spoke Arabic together. They didn't speak English. So there was that. But two, I didn't feel I had an appropriate poem for crisis and uprising. One that you call to mind in those moments of life when people need it. So anyway, Mayeda, who was the mother of the child and Khalid's wife, comes out and she's bringing the food out, and it's ma'luba. Now, ma'luba is this dish that we have that's like a big pot of rice, and then you turn it upside down, right? You'll have seen it, I'm sure, right? And you can have it with chicken or whatever. And so she puts it down, and we sit around it, and we're all sharing it. And there is the rice again. And I thought to myself, how can poems act like rice in times of crisis? And this is what I've really been reckoning with these past few years, and trying to think about what is a necessary poem, what is a practical poem. And I'm getting closer to figuring that out by studying the poems of social movements from the Sandinistas to in Palestine. Between 48 and 67, there was a cultural embargo where you weren't even allowed to print the word Palestine, right? So poets would go out into the villages and hold these illegal poetry festivals. And so they would use certain forms of their poems that would be memorable so that when they leave, the villagers can remember them and use them. So they had a certain form to them, practical, some would say. It was like rice, delivering rice, yeah? So this is something I've been thinking about, and it does exist, but I don't believe it's enough to say, I think my poems can solve world hunger. I don't think they're doing enough, and I don't think a lot of literature does enough. I don't think standing on stage shouting "Free Palestine" just to get the crowd going is really a very noble thing. And I really want to understand how, and I want us all to consistently reckon with how we are making that work practical.
Isn't that the most poetic answer, though? I want to write poetry like rice. I mean, mashallah, I love it. Something you said there, Lisa, really, really resonated with me, because one of the challenges that we face as Sudanese people is our cultural institutions being destroyed, like completely and utterly destroyed. the national museums, the historical archives, like everything has been raided. I mean, the RSF was using some of these buildings as torture chambers. So if I want to go and if I want to look up archives on Sudan, the best place I can go is Durham University, which is really painful, given that most of these people can't get a visa into this country. So for me, and I should also add that for a very long time, Sudan has been sanctioned by the United States for being a state sponsor of terrorism, and so it has lived outside the kind of the financial system, the literary system, like most kind of globalized systems that we understand as global. Sudan has sat outside of it. You cannot transfer money. Still to this day, you cannot transfer money to Sudan, right? You have to find ways. More recently, in the last couple of years since revolution, ways have been created, but it's very difficult. And unless you know somebody with a specific type of Sudanese bank account, it's not possible. And so, the preservation of what it is to be Sudanese, the preservation of our stories, the preservation of who we are as peoples, again, because we are multiple peoples, only occurs through stories. Only occurs through stories. And there is a real and genuine prospect that our stories will no longer exist if we do not keep telling them, maintaining them, repeating them, amplifying them, finding ways to preserve them. And so I think the thing that I think about is I'm not sure that a book fair, as you say, is going to solve everything, but I know that there was only one book fair that existed in Sudan, and it was actually having books was a radical thing because the censorship was so severe, right? And the act of writing stories was like an act of resistance. And so that's what I try to connect to. I try to think, what the hell is the point of this story that I'm trying to tell? Why am I telling this story? Is it practical likewise? Is it actually telling a truth? Like, how do I make sure that the things that I'm saying are true? And how do I make sure that they will live beyond me? But for me, success is building a body of work that will live beyond me. I will not be here to know if it will do that. But that is the intention that I try to create through. And so that is what I hope, that's the thing that I leave with you. Like, what is the work that you're creating that will live beyond you? What is the body? What is the stories you're telling? Why are you telling the story? And how is that urgent? And how is that true? And how is that real? And I think for Sudanese people, that is really urgent at the moment. And if we don't write the stories, then I'm not sure who will. So it is urgent.
This also is very important during that time of cultural embargo in Palestine as well. Actually, was archiving and kind of the underground cultural movement as well. There's the Legal Poetry Festivals, but there was magazines that were being produced. They were being funded by the USSR, but still fantastic. And I think that is the practicality of it. Like, even now in a certain time, I've been finding it very hard to slip into the dream language of poetry when I'm in urgent organizer brain. But I have to ask myself, what would I sit down to write for? And it's archiving the interiority of this social movement 100%. And the mechanisms of it.
I saw an exhibition in New York, which was about the Harlem Renaissance movement. And what they had was all of this stuff, these pamphlets about the things that they were talking about at the time, and the arguments they were having within the movements, and the conversations. And I was like, this is what we need to have of this moment, because we will pass that on, and we will continue to have these conversations. But actually recording what is going on, these kinds of conversations are vital. They're vital.
I think I lied about questions because we are out of time, and that is such a beautiful note from both of you to end on. Do come, we have a wee signing table that also happens to be beside our little electric sun. So do come, even if you're not getting a book, do explore the books on the table, but come and ask the questions you didn't get a chance to. Come and meet these two and ask them some questions. We will be at the back, and then get yourself a cup of tea downstairs, some biscuits, and warm up. Thank you for coming out today, and thank you, Lisa and Yassmin, for everything that you do and for connecting the dots for us as an audience, as readers, as actors in the world. So thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers.